I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you from Toronto, Canada. In today's show, we're going to start off by discussing about the UK elections. This is all meant to resolve the Brexit impasse. As we well know, though, last time around, Theresa May tried this stunt when it comes to elections. It didn't work out very well for her, with her losing her Conservative majority, then having to go into a coalition government with the DUP. And then it's been headaches upon headaches ever since when it comes to trying to resolve this Brexit impasse. Now we have a deal in place seemingly with the EU again, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who has reached that deal, especially when it comes to the Irish border backstop. But even then, that deal has not gone through completely at this time, especially with the deadline. That is that Prime Minister Johnson wanted. The deal itself was approved, I should say, but it was the deadline that was not approved. Johnson wanting to push it through within a couple of days to be able to meet the October 31st deadline, which obviously he hasn't. Now the deadline has been extended to January 2020. The elections will be on December 12th. Will voters even come out in the middle of winter? And that too in winters where 4 p.m. you have sunset. All those issues we'll discuss now with our panelists who are joining us. We're joined now by Thom, who is a professor of law and government and the dean of Durham University's Law School. He's joining us now from Durham in the UK. Joining us from London is Brolin, who is a political analyst, economist, and author of A State of Independence, Why the EU is the Problem, Not the Solution. Mark and Thom, thank you both for your time today. Thom, let me start with you. What do you make of these elections? There's obviously two parties with very opposing views when it comes to Brexit, even though Corbyn does say he agrees and is fine with the referendum results as they've worked out and will respect them, but would still want a second referendum seemingly on the deal itself. Will this result in a Labour government, do you think?
Possibly. I think it's a difficult prediction, a difficult election to predict in many ways. You have each of the major parties being squeezed. In the last general election, led by Theresa May versus Corbyn, you had a kind of real return of voters flocking to the two main parties and abandoning the Liberal Democrats and other smaller parties. I'm not so sure that that's going to happen right now. There'll be a big squeeze on the Tories from the Brexit party in particular, especially if Nigel Farage really does run candidates in seats where Conservatives have had majorities. It's not clear he will. On the other side, Labour will have a real squeeze on Liberal Democrats in particular in various places, so as well as the Brexit party. So I think it's a difficult one to predict. One thing I think I can be safe in predicting is that the Conservatives will be kind of really focused on Brexit as a key part of what they're all about, although they've been trying to say more about spending commitments on other areas. And Labour will look like they will continue like last time in talking about other issues, NHS, education, housing, public transport, and so on, which seem to resonate quite well with the voters, despite the fact that it didn't work out last time, may not work out this time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mark, because it does seem like Conservatives are almost a one-issue party at this point in time, especially under Boris Johnson. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, in a way, Boris Johnson has tried to extend the scope a bit, but this election is about Brexit. So I think in a sense, he's well positioned because of that. And I think also that this election is Boris Johnson's to lose because Labour is so weak. And I think also most elections are won by the leader who comes across as most in tune with the average voter. And we all know that we have staunch Remainers or we have staunch Leavers, but I think it's safe to say by now that the average voter does want to leave the EU with a deal, and that's precisely what Boris Johnson is offering. And of course, Corbyn is not. So I think, as I said from start, I think this is an election which is in which Boris Johnson is well positioned, and this is election to lose.
That's interesting. Okay, so Thom, I wonder at this point in time, because you mentioned Nigel Farage as well, Thom, do you think that the rumors of Nigel Farage possibly siding with the Conservatives just for the sake of Brexit to occur, that may actually happen, where Farage would almost go into an alliance of sorts with Johnson?
It'd be interesting to see if he actually does that. Of course, Nigel Farage has been campaigning against the Conservatives for decades. I'm not sure. I mean, while there's talk of pacts and he and Boris have been seen together during the referendum and afterwards, there's clearly at least some element of rapport between them. I'm not so sure that that Farage will do that. I think he likes the attention. I think he likes driving his agenda. And I think, he's someone who has tried 7, maybe it will be 8 times to be a member of parliament himself unsuccessfully. I think he will be very keen to have another go. And I think, there's probably nothing he would like more than to not be a member of the European Parliament, but become a member of the British Parliament and surrounded by other colleagues around him. I think also outside of London, where I live, people do not talk about Brexit all the time. There's strong views about wanting to leave, certainly here in County Durham. But it's not the daily talk, and I think that's something that will be lost on the London politicians and the Westminster bubble. But nonetheless, I think Farage will probably have a go, and it'll probably harm Boris's overall.
Mark, that's isn't it? Because if we're looking at this election overall, when it comes to Farage, and even we can talk about the Lib Dems on the other side, it seems that both of these parties are being pushed to the extremes of either left or right, aren't they? When it comes to either this issue of Brexit or even other issues that the country is facing, is that a good position for these sort of major parties to be in at this point, where neither is really too comfortable in knowing that they may or may not even get a majority in these upcoming elections?
In a sense, yes, but then I think every party has their definition of what's a moderate position. I think Boris Johnson feels quite comfortable where he is, where he's outflanked on one side by Farage and the other side by Lib Dems. And Labour is not making any noise at all when it comes to Brexit, besides disruption. So I think this moderate thing, if you listen outside the UK, everybody's saying that Leavers are hardliners and all that. But that's not really how it comes across in the UK anymore. I think now it's starting to come across as hardline to be a staunch Remainer as being a staunch Leaver. So every election is also a battle of coming across as the most moderate choice. And that's why I think Boris Johnson is not going to team up with Farage, because he wants to have that opposition against Farage. So in that sense, he's now coming across more and more as the moderate within his target groups.
All right, so for a moment, Thom, I want to talk about the others which the UK is facing, and you've already mentioned the NHS, and that's a big one because Corbyn has in fact said that the deal that Donald Trump wants to reach with the UK would in fact hurt the NHS, and that would be American commercialization of the NHS. Do you think that is likely to occur?
Well, I suppose it's a bit of yes and no. Donald Trump apparently told Nigel Farage on his LBC radio program that the trade deal that Boris Johnson had put together would be one that would prevent a free trade deal between the United States and UK. Something, of course, that contradicts earlier statements by Trump about the same deal. So Trump has been playing down whether or not this is even a good deal at all for our transatlantic trade. But put that to one side. I think that there certainly is some type of risk. We do know that Boris's advisors were meeting with pharmaceutical representatives to private industry to discuss the NHS. And this was not apparently disclosed to Matt Hancock, the health secretary, who said he had no knowledge of this taking place and denied there was any importance behind it. So I think that there is certainly pressure here. Of course, the Americans, I am American, have been very interested in tapping into the NHS and having some control or some share of that, and hoping Britain might privatize. There's been a lot of noises here. I don't think any person hoping to be prime minister on the right or the left, the Remain, the Leave, whatever the sides might be, it depends, what the sides are depends, I suppose, who you're talking to. I think any of them will say anything about wanting to sell the NHS, they'll all claim that they're not going to do so. Although I think, there is a real risk now in a country that is desperate to find trade deals, desperate to get income from somewhere else outside the EU to show that all of this wouldn't be a mistake, that the economy of things will really will bloom and bloom quickly. Hey, look at this. NHS is an obvious place for that crowd to look. So I think it's yes and no. I think it's uncertain. There'll be pressure to do it.
Mark, your thoughts on that? Because I know the NHS is something, it's a sensitive topic, obviously, for Britons. They hold it quite dear. And obviously, Johnson hasn't publicly said that the NHS would have American involvement in it. But do you think he's willing to go to that length to get a deal with the Americans? Because, Donald Trump, in fact, doesn't like his latest deal with the EU, as Thom there said as well.
No, I wouldn't think he would risk that. As you're saying, it's such a sensitive issue, NHS. I think in most elections we get muddled on the NHS issue. Everyone is saying we need reform because it obviously needs reform. So I think what we will see also in this election is a continuous muddle on the NHS issue.
Of course. No, we'll leave it there at that. Mark, I do apologize for cutting you off there, but of course we do appreciate both your time and Thom's time today, and of course putting this issue of the UK elections into context for us and our viewers, because it's a confusing time. Certainly, it's been a confusing time, certainly since the Brexit referendum even took place in the UK, where we've had Britons voting to leave the EU, but it's been complete chaos and a mess ever since that vote took place. Will these elections, that Prime Minister Johnson has called for in the middle of winter, mind you, will this work out in his favor or in Labour's favor or in any Britain, really? Keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the program, we're going to discuss Iraq's Prime Minister and his political future, and whether that is really now on the line because of the protests that have been taking place in that country for quite a while now. The president of the country has apparently announced that the Prime Minister has agreed to step down as long as there's a replacement to be put in place immediately. This, of course, comes after there were rumors that Muqtada al-Sadr and Hadi al-Amiri had also reached a deal. Al-Amiri is, of course, part of an Iran-backed group as well in the country, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, as they are called. And, of course, Muqtada al-Sadr, as we well know, is a popular cleric in that country as well. But then later on, there was seemingly a falling out with the involvement of an Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, who had tried to convince, and this is according to Reuters, tried to convince al-Amiri not to, in fact, call for the ouster of Adel Mahdi. There's a lot of course, conflicting reports going around, but the president now saying that Adel Mahdi has apparently agreed to step down. Will this resolve all the outstanding issues, though, is the important thing to remember and to ask questions about. Will this resolve corruption? Will this resolve mismanagement? Will this increase or better the economy and the fair distribution of wealth in a country that is genuinely quite wealthy because of its oil sales? And, of course, all of this coming in the wake of the American involvement in that country as well. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by Riyadh, Mohammed, who is an Iraqi multimedia investigative journalist who covered the Iraq war, corruption, and ISIS for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and others. He's also writing a book currently on ISIS. He's joining us now from New York. Joining us from Sydney is Ali Mamouri, who is the editor of the Iraq Pulse at Al Monitor and is former lecturer at the University of Sydney and University of Tehran. Ali and Riyadh, thank you both for your time today. So, Ali, let me go to you with that question, in fact. Do you think that the ouster of Adel Mahdi will make any difference in giving the voters what they really want?
The removal is an essential step that should be taken as soon as possible, but is not enough to calm the streets at all. People are not asking for the Prime Minister step down just. They are asking for something much more. They want to change the entire political process that was established after 2003, and it was the source of corruption and source of this government that is not able to provide a service, to provide dignity, to provide respect to the Iraqi people. They want to change the constitution. They want early election. They want a new electoral law, and they want a new electoral commission. They want UN's supervision on the transitional process, and they want the foreign countries to stop interfere in the Iraqi matters. So the demand is much more bigger and higher than removal of the prime minister. But the removal of the prime minister is the first step and the very important step in the beginning.
But then I wonder, though, Ali, if what the president said then will be seen as enough, because yes, he's called for snap elections as well, saying that, of course, if Adel Mahdi does step down, in fact, as he has announced he will. Do you think that snap election will again resolve the issues? Because you've already said that the voters are also, or protesters are also calling for a change in the electoral law. So, I mean, I imagine there needs to be a step-by-step process here, and a snap election in and of itself won't resolve that situation?
I think the protesters already responded to this question today, when we can see the number of Iraqi protesters growing rapidly, and just today millions of people in Baghdad and other southern cities are in the street. On the other side, the government called for another protest to support the government reform, but no one responded to that one. Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf, he called today in the Friday prayer lecture to support and to fulfill all the protesters' demand and to stop other foreign parties to interfere in this matter. Barham Saleh promises it's not enough because, first of all, he doesn't have power to implement and execute these promises. And second of all, it just talk. Nothing happened practically. If he is serious, he should come with the prime minister announcing his withdrawal, his removal, his dismissal, his resignation from the post. And after that, taking the other steps one after the other one very quickly and without delay. It seems that the protesters are looking at the president promises yesterday as just wording to trying them to leave the streets and calm the protests.
Okay, so Riyadh is back with us. Riyadh, if you can hear me, tell me about what you make of the possible ouster, confirmation of the ouster, that is, of Adel Mahdi on the part of Barham Saleh. Do you think that it's enough, A? And, in the lead up to this announcement, there was also rumors and talk about Al-Amiri and Al-Sadr, uniting to oust the prime minister. Those were interesting dynamics as well, weren't they?
First, I just want to correct a few things. This was initially talked about that Mamouri and Sadr will cooperate to replace the prime minister, but after that, everybody understood that this is not going to be the case anymore. Mamouri is not going to replace him. The main standpoint now is that the political class that produce Adel Abdul Mahdi as a prime minister, except for Sadr, which is the biggest bloc in the parliament, they think that allowing him to step down will actually give this movement, this uprising or revolution more, and they will make them ask for more. So they think it's better for them to resist and continue telling them that we are doing reforms and all what you need to do is to wait, which is completely nonsense.
So Riyadh, what do you make of the external forces trying to, of course, influence how things go in Iraq? So, of course, we have the Iranians on one side, and there was a Reuters report about General Qasem Soleimani speaking to Mamouri, telling him not to withdraw support for Adel Mahdi. And then, of course, when we have the Americans as well, who, as you well know from day one, would not want any Iranian influence in Iraq to begin with, and would want, of course, influence of their own. I imagine neither of that, is a good thing for the country, is it?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Iranian influence is way, way more than the American now. American rarely have any real influence anymore in the Iraqi politics. They really interfere when there is a huge thing like when ISIS took Mosul, but their influence is not big as the Iranian. And the good thing about this uprising is that for the first time in a generation, or at least since the removal of Saddam Hussein, Iraqis are getting involved, and they're refusing all sorts of foreign influence, Iranian, anybody. And also, they are refusing the entire political class. They are refusing the constitution that was passed in 2005. They are asking for replacing almost everything.
Okay, tell us about, again, the foreign influence, as I put to Riyadh as well, because it's important to talk about this. We talk a lot about the Iranian influence as well in the country. But do you think that in some ways that Iran would just be worried about stability on its borders? So that's why possibly Qasem Soleimani or somebody else would want this prime minister to stay in place simply for stability's sake?
Iranians, unfortunately, are looking at Iraq as another case of Syria, that they think that they should support the prime minister and they should resist with all power to not respond to the protesters. Because if they respond to the protesters positively and they accept some steps, the protesters will continue demanding more and more and more. So they did it before. In Iran, Qasem Soleimani just told the Iraqi security officials yesterday in his meeting that we know how to deal with this kind of protests. We had it in Iran before. After the controversial elections that was very high and strong uprising in Iran, Iranian security forces suppressed the protest very heavily and didn't allow them to, didn't accept anything from them and didn't allow them to come and negotiate. They did the same thing in Syria and they are doing the same thing in Iraq. But the result of this kind of treating with the protest is very dangerous. This game in Iraq will have much more problem and issues than Iran and Syria. And Iranians are playing very dangerous game.
Okay, so, regardless of these external forces, be it Iran or anybody else, do you think it's important to note, and it's a positive thing possibly, that these protests are not limited to any specific sect or ethnicity within Iraqi society? So you have the Shias, the Sunnis, and everybody else already all protesting side by side, seemingly, where you even have Najaf and Baghdad and these other cities all out on the streets. That says something, I imagine, that there's unity almost amongst the people, even if there are major problems within the politicians. That's possibly a good thing, right?
It is not, that's not exactly accurate. What's happened, it's really a Shia revolution against the Shia political class or the ruling class. The Sunni community in general decided that while they're supporting the demands of those protesters, they thought right, that it's better for them not to be involved because they will be accused as being motivated by terrorism or by foreign influence from Turkey or Saudi Arabia, and I think they made the right choice. There are now some minor supporting, like, sit-ins in cities like Bakuba, but it's mainly a Shia revolution against their political class. The good thing about that, to confirm what we were saying, is that those Shia are protesting their own Shia political class. So the main sentiments in the country now is non-sectarian. They don't care about the sects, and that's no longer a big issue in Iraqi politics, or at least among those protesters who are now millions.
Very well. Well, leaders, a final, of course, we appreciate both Riyadh and Ali for their time today, and of course, putting this context, this entire issue in Iraq into context, because it's an important discussion to have. From what Riyadh said right at the end, if it is that the Shias of Iraq have risen up against politicians who are mainly Shia as well, And as Riyadh said, that goes to show there's a non-sectarian now twist to all of this, which is possibly a very positive thing from the narrative that all of us have been taught about Iraq, that everything is very sectarian there. So if that is now the case, that we're moving away from that, I mean, possibly that can only really be a good thing for the country, where politicians will know that they will be held to account, regardless of which sect or ethnicity they belong to within Iraqi society, and that they will be held to account, be it by their own sect or be it by other sects or be it by other citizens of the country. Now, of course, we now have this announcement by the Iraqi president that the prime minister will step down, snap elections will take place. But as Ali there said as well, electoral law changes need to take place as well, as demanded by protesters, to reflect what their desires are going forward for their country. Will that occur, or will this just be more bandage on the wound? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Viewers, in today's final segment, we're going to discuss Twitter banning all political ads. Now, that's quite an important move. Obviously, Twitter doesn't have as much influence, seemingly, over elections as does Facebook. And this seems to have been targeted at Facebook itself, where also Twitter doesn't earn as much money as Facebook does from political ads. Is it just targeting of companies from one to another, or is this actually an important political message and a message being sent that social media platforms shouldn't be venues where you air your political opinions, or at least advertise just your side of what your opinion may be on the political spectrum? Now, personally, I think it's a good thing to have Twitter or social media not be playing a role in all this, because it's just a question of those who have more money than getting more influence, isn't it? Or maybe it really isn't that simple, because the argument goes both ways when it comes to that, where Mark Zuckerberg then says, listen, we can't just censor politicians and not allow them to have the right to advertise their views on social media. Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Patrick Basham, who is the founding director of the Democracy Institute, a politically independent research organization. He is based usually in Washington, D.C., but he's currently joining us from Los Angeles. Patrick, good morning. Tell us what your thoughts are, Patrick, about this Twitter ban. Which side of the argument do you lie on when it comes to social media, even allowing political ads? Because I know now that is something that is being debated, in fact.
While I believe very strongly that any corporation is entitled to decide for itself whether or not it runs advertising, whether it's political advertising or other kind of advertising. So these social media companies, I think the decision should be theirs. The government shouldn't tell them whether they can or whether they cannot. I do think that it's regrettable that Twitter's made this decision. And as you suggested in your introduction, I think they've made it because for two reasons. One is they receive a boost in terms of public image, because it makes them seem like appear to be the company that's concerned about fake news and the ones that are concerned about sort of the civic virtue of America. But also, of course, they are able to, they think, put themselves in an advantageous position commercially vis-a-vis the likes of Facebook. So I understand the decision they've made for commercial, private, corporate reasons, but I think it's unfortunate for the larger system, because it's most important, I think, that there be more discussion, there be more debate, there be more views aired rather than less. And I acknowledge, I recognize that obviously there are mistruths out there, there's misinformation out there. There's no question that exists, and we can argue whether it's more or less than in the past. But the bottom line, I think, is that we will have better debates, and we're more likely to figure out what's accurate and what's inaccurate, what's factual and what's just made up information, if we have more, we hear more voices, more people are involved.
But then that's interesting that you say that, Patrick, because, at a time, as you well know, of the Russia collusion thing that occurred when it came to the elections that brought Trump into office, ever since then, it seems to have just been this crackdown, right, on many online. Now, whether legitimate or not, I'm not saying it's all wrong. Obviously, there is a very significant amount of fake news out there, as Donald Trump would like to, of course, also point out. But nevertheless, there are some important voices who are critical of X, Y, Z, and a lot of the times they're also being then caught up in this crackdown online. How then does one, as you say, have more discussion at a time where it seems like the push is to only really have almost just very censored, very specific kinds of discussion only?
One of the problems, one of the dangers we have is that we are all individually and institutionally concerned about fake news, and we're concerned about only one side being heard. But the truth of it is that is often, whether as individuals or as political parties or as governments, that I think is sort of camouflage for the fact that we're worried that our opinion and our side of the debate isn't being heard as loudly as we would like, or that we're being overwhelmed by the other side. So I think we have to be very careful that politicians of all stripes, and not just in America, use the notion that they are protecting sort of the public square, and that they are very well intentioned and virtuous in their attempting to ensure that everyone has a say, that it's not simply a way of sort of gaming the system so that their voice or the voices they support are the ones that are heard. Because I think if we're honest with one another, we recognize there's misinformation and fake news across the board. But the stuff that really upsets us is the stuff that we disagree with, or the stuff that we think furthers the other side. So it's, again, I think there's not a solution as such, but the answer in terms of improving the situation rather than making it worse is to ensure that everyone has a say. And the natural response to that is, well, yes, but it costs money to have a say. And that is true. But I think today, one thing we probably can all agree on is that the political system is awash in money, and that there is money behind every viewpoint. Whether you want Trump impeached or not, whether you think climate change is an existential threat or you think the opposite. There are individuals who are willing to write small checks and very rich people writing very large checks. Everyone's voice can be heard, and let's have more voices heard rather than fewer.
Indeed, and one of the things that stood out for me, because originally I thought this ban was only for candidates, but it seems that Twitter is taking this a step further and saying, listen, no, we're actually going to ban ads about issues of national importance. As you said, climate change, and then there's healthcare as well, and immigration. That possibly is a step too far, genuinely, isn't it, if we're just talking about politics? Because that just makes it ever harder upon Twitter. I mean, I almost feel like Twitter is creating a monster which it itself won't be able to control.
Oh, I agree. I think you put it very well, better, no doubt, than I would have myself. It's when you include quote unquote issues, it is a limitless ban. Because for someone may say there may be an issue. Let's say that I'm not particularly bothered about, gay rights. It's not something that just affects me day to day, and I'm just not that concerned about it. So I'm okay, ban issues, gay rights issue advertising. But if I can quite imagine that someone who is active in that movement, for them, it's not a political issue. It's their life. It's their lifestyle. It's about the core of who they are. And so they would think to themselves, well, why, in effect, am I banned from Twitter? Like, why am I talking about my life or freedoms and liberties? It is a very slippery slope, I would imagine. And we have to hope, I think, that even if Twitter doesn't change its mind on this, that the other major social media instruments choose not to go along this path, because issue advertising is really, really about debating not the partisan nature of our election, but the true substantive public policies
Yep. Okay, Patrick, I'll have to leave it there at that. But of course, we do appreciate your time this morning speaking to us from Los Angeles as Dr. Basham, the founding director of the Democracy Institute. Viewers, it's an important issue when social media giants want to play within the political sphere. Is this a smart move by Twitter to ban political advertising altogether? Or is this just Twitter targeting Facebook, who it knows is a much larger player anyways in this sphere and makes a lot more money when it comes to this sort of political advertising as well? Mark Zuckerberg isn't seemingly playing ball in this sense, saying that, listen, you can't just censor all politicians or even issues of national importance such as climate change, etc. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that and how this may affect the election coming up in 2020 in the U.S. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.